Imagine you're walking through a park and suddenly you notice that there's some splashing coming from the nearby pond. You look, it's a child. They're drowning. Now you could easily jump in and save them, and all it would cost you is ruining the clothes you're wearing. So, what are you doing? Now almost everyone would say the same thing. Save the child. Obviously. The clothes don't matter in comparison. The child's life is way more valuable. And what's interesting about that is almost nobody hesitates. Nobody says, well, the clothes were pretty expensive, or someone else will probably help, or even I didn't put the child in the pond, so it's not my responsibility to help get them out. We just save them. It feels obvious, almost self-evident. But what happens when we change the circumstances slightly? Move the child thousands of miles away. Replace the pond with a charity website. Replace the ruined clothes with a donation. Now suddenly the situation feels completely different, even though from the child's perspective, nothing's changed at all. This thought experiment, popularised by the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, is effectively the start of a popular philosophy called Effective Altruism. And honestly, I think it might be one of the most challenging philosophies I've come across. Because once you accept the logic of saving the child in front of you, it's very hard to explain why we don't make similar sacrifices for other people elsewhere. And if that sounds uncomfortable for you, good. It means I'm not the only one. So, I've spent my last few videos talking about values. Reducing suffering, increasing flourishing, preserving future flourishing. But if we genuinely care about those things, then another question naturally follows. How should we actually act on them? Because caring alone isn't enough. Good intentions aren't enough. If we want to reduce suffering, surely we should care about whether our actions are actually doing that. And that's essentially what effective altruism is. The idea itself is pretty simple. If we want to help others, we should try and help them as effectively as possible. Not just do good, but do the most good we reasonably can. To use evidence and reason to work out where our time, money, and energy can actually have the greatest impact. And if you've watched my previous videos, you'll probably see why this idea interests me so much, because it maps almost perfectly onto the distinction between ends and means. If our end goal is to reduce suffering and promote flourishing, then surely we should care about which actions actually achieve those goals most effectively. So, one of the key things that effective altruism points out is that not all attempts to do good are equally effective. In fact, some charities can be many times more effective than others at improving or saving lives. Two people can invest exactly the same amount of money with exactly the same intentions, but have vastly different impacts. And this is what I find so compelling about the philosophy. Because if we're serious about reducing suffering, then intentions aren't enough. Outcomes matter too. And that's a really uncomfortable idea, because it means we can't just ask, did I do something good? We also have to ask, did I do the most good I reasonably could have done? But this is where things start to become difficult, because if you begin to take this idea seriously, it raises some really uncomfortable questions. Questions like, how much should I give? Should I donate locally or wherever's going to have the greatest impact? How much of my own comfort am I justified in keeping? And perhaps the hardest question of all, at what point have I done enough? And honestly, I don't think there are easy answers to any of those questions. And I've got to admit, this is something that I have personally really struggled with. And there have been periods in my life where thinking about this stuff has genuinely made me feel powerless. Because if you follow the logic far enough, it can start to feel really overwhelming. Like you're never doing enough. Like there's always more suffering. Always more people who need help. Always more lives you could potentially save. And if you're not careful, almost every purchase you make starts to feel incredibly hard to justify. Why buy this? Why go there? Why spend money on myself when I could donate it instead? And before long, you can find yourself feeling really guilty about some pretty trivial things. A coffee, a meal out, a new nice pair of trainers. Because in the back of your mind, there's always that voice asking, could this money have done more good elsewhere? And honestly, there have been times where I've actually wondered whether I'd be better off having never encountered these ideas at all, because life was certainly simpler before then. But at the same time, I was always grateful that I had, because it felt like I'd encountered a truth that I couldn't unsee. The moral equivalent of seeing an owl's legs for the first time. And now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. And I didn't want to live in a bubble. I didn't want to feel good about myself just because I decided not to look. And as hard as it was, I wanted to take these ideas seriously. But for a while, I got trapped there. Trapped between wanting to help, but feeling overwhelmed by how much there was to do. Recently though, I listened to a philosopher called Will McGaskill, who by the way is a genuinely amazing human being. And he explained something that really changed my perspective. He said, instead of thinking relatively, think absolutely. Instead of asking, have you done everything you possibly could have done? Instead ask, who is better off because you acted? Maybe you haven't solved all suffering. That was always a pretty hard goal to aim for anyway. But if 5 people are alive who otherwise wouldn't have been, that's still 5 people. 5 people with futures, relationships, experiences, lives. And that is infinitely better than 0. And so that shift in perspective has been so important for me, because now, rather than letting the overwhelm defeat me, I'm simply trying to do better than I did yesterday. So, effective altruism is not without its fair share of criticisms and drawbacks. People argue it's too calculating. Morality can't be reduced to just numbers. And as I discovered, it can ask an awful lot of us. If followed rigorously, it leaves very little room for personal projects, relationships, just enjoying your life. And these criticisms are worth taking seriously, because even in my own framework, I haven't said that it's all about reducing suffering. I've also said that we need to maximize flourishing, and that includes your own flourishing too. Burnout helps nobody, and sacrificing absolutely everything will just reduce your ability to do good in the long run. But while I don't think effective altruism gives us a perfectly polished answer, I still think it's an incredibly important idea, because it forces us to ask questions most of us rarely ask. Questions about fairness, disassociation, responsibility, and how seriously we are willing to take our own values. Because if we genuinely believe that suffering matters, then surely we have to be willing to ask ourselves difficult questions about what our actions actually achieve. Not perfectly, not endlessly, just honestly. We're never going to solve all suffering, but we can all do something. And maybe that's enough for now. Because if there's one thing that effective altruism has taught me, it's that our actions matter. Even when they seem small, even when they're imperfect. And perhaps that's reason enough to try. Thanks for watching.